Welcome to Delaware Riverkeeper Network's hydrogen webinar tonight, Fracked Gas-Powered Hydrogen, I'm Feeling Blue. And I'm Tracy Carluccio, Deputy Director of Delaware Riverkeeper Network. Tonight, we're fortunate to have environmental scientist Dr. Robert Howarth as our special guest, and he's going to lead us through a discussion of hydrogen gas and how it's produced with fossil gas and what the implications are for the climate. At this time, I'm going to be handing it over to Annika Van Rossum, Advocacy and Policy Coordinator for Delaware Riverkeeper Network, who will introduce Dr. Robert Howarth. Annika?
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Yes, so as Tracy said, Dr. Howarth will be giving us a great presentation, and then Tracy will be following up with the Mach 2 update. And just for everyone as well, if you could please, any questions you have, please put them in the Q&A box. So without further ado, Dr. Robert Howarth is an Earth Systems Scientist and Ecosystem Biologist with a BA from Amherst College and a Ph.D. jointly from MIT and the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. He joined the faculty of Cornell University in 1985 and was appointed the David R. Atkinson Professor of Ecology and Environmental Biology in 1993. He also is an Adjunct Senior Scientist at the Marine Biological Lab in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, and is co-editor-in-chief of the journal Ocean Land Atmosphere Research. Dr. Howarth has published over 250 scientific papers, reports, and book chapters, and has edited or authored 8 books. His research is broad-ranging and includes climate effects on nutrient pollution in lakes and coastal ecosystems, nitrogen effects in coastal marine ecosystems, sources of methane from natural gas operations in agriculture, atmospheric ammonia pollution, alternative energy policies, and life cycle assessments for hydrogen, liquefied natural gas, and renewable natural gas. He is one of 22 members of New York's Climate Action Council, the group charged with implementing the state's ambitious climate goals laid out in the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act of 2019. And we will be putting links in the chat to connect you with some of Dr. Howarth's recent work and news. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Dr. Robert Howarth.
Thank you, Annika, for that kind introduction. Okay, let's start with where hydrogen comes from. The vast majority, 96% of hydrogen globally today comes from fossil fuels. And throughout North America and Europe, virtually all of this hydrogen is produced from natural gas. And natural gas is mostly methane gas. And methane is both the chemical feedstock by which we make hydrogen. You take that methane and natural gas and you put it under high heat and pressure. You add a little bit of steam to it, and it breaks down into hydrogen and carbon dioxide. It takes a lot of energy to produce that heat and that pressure, and that comes by burning more natural gas. So natural gas is both the energy source and the chemical feedstock, and it takes a lot of natural gas to make hydrogen. The technology for doing this has been around for since the late 1800s. It's not new science, not new industry, but it's energy intensive, and we call that gray hydrogen. Hydrogen goes by color names for obscure reasons. Next slide, please. So blue hydrogen is largely what I'm talking about today, is hydrogen made the same way. You take natural gas, you put it under pressure and heat, but for blue hydrogen, there's an effort made to capture the carbon dioxide that's released when that methane breaks down into hydrogen and carbon dioxide. This is new. It's a new idea. I mean, the term and the idea first popped up just in 2015. The French gas company Air Liquide came up with this, and it's been heavily promoted by industry over the last 6 or 7 years by a group called the Hydrogen Council, which is set up by big oil and gas, BP, Shell, Total, others. ExxonMobil's a member, and their sole purpose is to promote hydrogen to society and to politicians and to the press. So far, blue hydrogen is still theoretical, more or less. There have only been 2 commercial efforts, and we'll talk about those in a minute. Next slide, please. So I want to give a little bit of context as to where this is coming from. This whole idea of carbon capture and storage is being used increasingly by big oil and gas as a climate solution, a way to continue to use fossil fuels while solving the climate crisis is their argument. I want to point out that this has been tried for decades in coal burning power plants, and it's just not particularly effective. The best they've really done for any length of time is to capture about 65% of the carbon dioxide, but that's a gross capture rate. It takes energy to power that carbon capture, and there's emissions associated with that as well. So when you look at the net reduction of carbon capture in these coal burning power plants, you're really only capturing about 35% of what's emitted. For natural gas power plants, no one yet has ever tried to capture it, but it'd be similar, one would assume. And I just want to add that for most natural gas in the U.S. and certainly in the Northeast, is used for heating of homes and commercial buildings. And no one ever thinks you could have carbon capture and storage at the level of individual homes. So next slide. This is where blue hydrogen comes in. It's the public relations solution from oil and gas to what they're going to do with carbon capture overall. For providing energy for people's homes, they say they'll capture the carbon, they'll produce hydrogen instead, they'll take that hydrogen into their gas pipeline systems and deliver that as fuel to the homes. So that's where the idea is coming from. It's an argument to keep the status quo going, just substituting in hydrogen. Next slide. Again, this has been around for about 6 or 7 years, promoted heavily. And this is one example of a typical promotional thing you can find online for blue hydrogen. They're getting a little bit more careful, but for quite a while, they're saying it was zero emissions or nearly zero emissions. They're now more likely to say it's low carbon emissions, which is slightly more honest, but still not entirely honest. Next slide. So I first heard of blue hydrogen in the spring of 2020. As Annika mentioned, I'm on the commission in New York that's charged with developing an implementation plan for our climate law. Number one source of greenhouse gas emissions in New York State is the energy we use in our homes and commercial buildings, mostly natural gas. And so the commission quickly agreed we needed to get rid of gas for heating, and we need to move on to something else. The solution we ended up with is electric heat pumps. Get rid of natural gas totally for heating. But the industry didn't like that. The gas industry didn't like it at all. And they started making the case to us in the spring of 2020 that really the easiest solution for New York was to use blue hydrogen, convert again our natural gas to hydrogen, put it into the pipeline system and use the existing infrastructure. I was skeptical from the start. I started looking for where the literature was on what the actual greenhouse gas impact of blue hydrogen might be. And it turns out there was no literature. No one had studied this in any sort of rigorous way. So working with Mark Jacobson, a brilliant engineer at Stanford, he and I produced a paper that we published in 3 years ago now, August of 2021, looking at this question of how green is blue hydrogen? What is the greenhouse gas footprint of this blue hydrogen? Next slide. So it's a fairly simple study. And I'll just give you a brief sense of what it is. Methane emissions that occur when you use shale gas, when you develop it at site and when you move it through pipelines is an important part of that. Greenhouse gas emissions aren't just about carbon dioxide. We assumed that about 3.5% of the natural gas that is produced would be emitted to the atmosphere unburned on its way to a blue hydrogen plant. It could be a higher or lower number than that. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, but we thought that was the best number at the time. We did a sensitivity analysis, though, to explore how robust our conclusions might be. When you compare carbon dioxide and methane, you need to establish a time frame because methane has a much shorter lifetime in the atmosphere than does carbon dioxide. We chose a 20-year time frame, although we explored using 100 as well. I'm convinced that 20 years is the correct time frame, but that's something industry hates and we scientists are still debating. And then we said that the methane, when the methane breaks down into carbon dioxide and hydrogen, that industry might be able to capture up to 85% of that on a gross level. And for the natural gas that's burned, they might be able to capture some 65% of that. Next slide, please. So this is our one of our summary figures. You're looking here at the greenhouse gas footprint of various fuels, including hydrogen, for the equivalent amount of energy that's produced. And here, the yellowish color are the carbon dioxide emissions, and the red methane emissions converted to carbon dioxide equivalents. And on the left is gray hydrogen, Next to that, moving to the right, is blue hydrogen. And you can see that the carbon dioxide emissions are less for blue hydrogen than for gray hydrogen, but not by much. And the methane emissions are more because you actually have to use more natural gas to power the carbon dioxide capture, and that has more upstream methane emissions. If we compare that with natural gas, which is that bar in the middle, its greenhouse gas footprint is actually less than blue hydrogen, significantly less. So blue hydrogen as a fuel has a greenhouse gas footprint that is significantly worse than natural gas or diesel oil or coal. We're really much better off just using natural gas as a fuel instead of going through all this shenanigans. Next slide. Same slide here, but I've added one more bar for blue hydrogen. The last one I showed you was what industries tried to do so far, which is to make no effort to capture the carbon dioxide from the gas they're burning. And here we say, well, if you try to burn it, the footprint might go down a little bit more. That's to the right. And our calculations show that, yes, indeed, the carbon dioxide emissions go down a little bit more, but the methane emissions go up even more because it takes even more natural gas to power the energy to capture the additional carbon dioxide. So it's really ineffective. And again, you're better off simply burning natural gas. Next slide. Just want to say a little bit about methane because it really is underappreciated by a lot of people. And this is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from a couple of years ago. And what you're looking at on the left there is the net warming of the planet over the last 150 years or so. And next to it, the total of the gases which contribute to it, warming agents. And there are also gases which cause cooling, mostly sulfur gases. So we've warmed the planet as of this time by about 1.1 degrees Celsius. It's now up to about 1.3, 1.4 degrees Celsius, just in the time since this report has come out. But we know what's driving that, and that's the next bars over there. Of those warming agents, carbon dioxide is responsible for about 0.75 degrees of that warming, and methane for about 0.5. So methane's not as important as carbon dioxide, but it's pretty close. And we really need to get methane emissions under control. Next slide. Of all of the warming that's occurred on this planet since the 1800s, a third is due to methane. And so we really do need to reduce our methane emissions. Next slide. So our paper is very simple. We left out things which would have made hydrogen look even worse because it would be too complicated to explain, and we thought it would be vulnerable to attacks from the industry. So we kept it very simple, very transparent, relatively few assumptions going into it. And we did sensitivity analyses, which are the next slide. Next slide, please. And here's, we did several sensitivity analysis, but I'll just show you ones for the hydrogen case. The top there where I've circled saying our baseline case, those are the numbers I just showed you. And that's for a methane emission rate of 3.5% and looking at under a 20-year time frame. The worst case of our scenarios is 4.3% emission for methane, which is certainly possible. And it's possible that we're underestimating the climatic influence of methane as well. So things could be worse, but the take-home message is the same. Blue hydrogen's a little bit better than the traditional gray hydrogen that we've had around for 100 plus years, but not by much. And all hydrogen is far worse than simply burning natural gas. The best case scenario in terms of hydrogen is the bottom down there. We assume a very low methane emission rate, and we look only over a 100-year time scale, which downplays the importance of methane. And in this case, blue hydrogen still isn't very good, but it's comparable to natural gas. It's similar, it might be a little bit better, a little bit worse, but this really understates the damage. The bottom line is there's no way you can say that this is a good, desirable fuel with low emissions. It's extremely high emitting. Next slide. I want to say a little bit about where that methane comes from because it's often described as methane leaking, and that sort of makes you think it's just forfeiting pipes or something like that, and all you have to do is go in and fix it. Now, again, we're talking about 3.5% or so of the production, relatively small number, and some of it is from leaks, but most of it's not. Most of it's a routine part of the whole process of developing shale gas. And I won't go through this in any detail. Let me just go to the last line on there, blowdowns for pipeline maintenance as an obvious example of a problem. When you go to do maintenance on a high pressure pipeline that's moving natural gas to market, you have to get the gas out of the pipeline first. It's extremely dangerous to weld in a pipeline full of methane gas. So the solution is to simply blow all of the methane into the atmosphere. It's called a blowdown. It doesn't happen every day. It only happens when you do major um, maintenance on the pipeline, but that happens routinely enough that it's a major source of the emissions. And the industry has no solution to that. No one has thought of any way to do maintenance without blowing it off to the atmosphere, which is true of some of these other sources as well. So this is not an easy problem to solve. If we're going to use natural gas, we're going to emit methane, and that's bad for the climate. Using it for blue hydrogen makes it even worse. Next slide. This is just from a paper that I published a year and a half ago now, sort of an update on methane emissions from what we used in the blue hydrogen paper with Mark Jacobson. And we're thinking at that point, the data were showing even slightly higher emissions. Next slide. We got a lot of really favorable press for our paper. I just want to note that New York Times in particular did a very nice job of covering our work. I appreciate that. Next slide. And partly for that reason, industry got really annoyed with us. And they kept saying on social media and elsewhere that there's going to be a major rebuttal and that we were just really, really wrong, et cetera. It took a while for their rebuttal to come out. When it came out, it turns out it was written by a bunch of people with oil and gas connections who didn't have much history of looking at this area. That's a strangely written paper, but I'll point out one thing. They claimed that we were way off on our methane emissions, that methane emissions couldn't possibly be as high as we said. And the only source of information they used to make that statement was this cartoon from a website, which says that methane emissions are near zero. So they said that since there's an industry cartoon saying it's near zero, we're wrong to use the peer-reviewed literature, which says it's up in the 3.5, 3.7%. We wrote a reply to that, ridiculing them, basically. Next slide. And I just want to add that the science on methane emissions and natural gas is improving all of the time. And this is from a major paper that came out in Nature in March of this year, just a few months ago now. In this case, much more comprehensive than what we used before. It's based on almost 1 million observations. And their conclusions are that the, next slide, might say, not sure. Yeah. Their conclusions are that methane emissions are indeed quite high. Perhaps some fields are worse than the assumptions we're making. Some are better. On average, they think it's probably slightly not as bad as our mean estimate, but pretty close, and certainly well within the range of the sensitivity analyses we did showing that methane's a problem. Next slide. Well, I want to say a little bit more about hydrogen's direct role as an agent of climate warming. Methane's a powerful greenhouse gas. Carbon dioxide is a powerful greenhouse gas. Hydrogen is not a greenhouse gas. It does not absorb infrared radiation. And we ignored its climatic influence in our paper for that reason. But in the time since our paper's been published, just in the last 3 years, there have been other newer papers coming out pointing out that we should be thinking of hydrogen's influence directly on the climate. And that's because when we emit hydrogen into the atmosphere, it interacts with other agents of climatic warming. For instance, if you have more hydrogen in the atmosphere, methane stays in the atmosphere longer. Ozone stays in the atmosphere longer. You get more water vapor in the stratosphere, which also causes warming. So it's not a greenhouse gas, but it interacts with other things to aggravate global warming. And we don't really know, next slide, please. We don't really know how much hydrogen is emitted because no one has ever measured how much hydrogen is emitted when we move it through pipelines and use it, et cetera. But hydrogen is the smallest molecule in the universe. It's the smallest gas. The smaller gas is, the leakier it is in terms of actual pipeline leaks. And so it's going to be at least as bad as methane leaks and some of the other issues with blowdowns and all apply to hydrogen as well. And so making a rough guess of what the hydrogen emission rates might be and looking how it interacts with those other climate influencers, I've added on here hydrogen to the greenhouse gas footprint of what I showed you before. And it's not the major player, but it makes hydrogen, including blue hydrogen, even worse. I've also shown you over there in the extreme left the greenhouse gas footprint for green hydrogen, which would be hydrogen made without any fossil fuels and just from renewable electricity through electrolysis. It still has a climate impact because of this indirect effect. Next slide. So let me just make a couple of points moving towards conclusion here. Blue hydrogen is a terrible idea as a fuel from a climate perspective, and yet it's still being heavily promoted by oil and gas industry. And I want to note that, in the past 100+ years, society's used hydrogen very rarely for fuel. It's not a particularly good fuel. It's been used largely as a chemical feedstock, and that's to make nitrogen fertilizer, for instance, and in oil refineries to make plastics and things like that. People have started to talk over the last decade or so about the role of hydrogen in a decarbonized energy future, maybe for things like steel manufacturing, et cetera. But hydrogen, since 2017, again, has been highly hyped by the oil and gas industry, and they talk explicitly about using it to heat homes and all. That's what they want to do. They want to continue to use large amounts of natural gas, so they want to blend it through. After our paper came out in 2021, industry started backing off of the whole terminology of blue hydrogen, and they now call it a clean energy or clean hydrogen and confuse green and blue hydrogen, but it's still basically blue hydrogen they're talking about. Next slide. So again, the other colors, a lot of colors of hydrogen. I've been talking about gray and blue. Green, again, is the truly the cleanest of the hydrogens you're going to get, which is made from renewable electricity. Still has some climate influence. You can also make hydrogen from nuclear power electricity, and that's called pink. Next slide. So is there really a role for this clean hydrogen or pink hydrogen in our energy future? And my take is that yes, maybe, but it would be for things like maybe storing surplus wind and solar power at times, or hard to decarbonize needs. But the more I look at hydrogen, the more other people look at hydrogen, it's becoming clear that for any use of hydrogen as a fuel, there are alternatives. And often the alternatives are cheaper, easier, have lower greenhouse gas impacts. So the reason that society is all excited about hydrogen these days is because of the influence, the advertising influence of the oil and gas industry. I think we should all be quite clear on that. In any case, hydrogen should never be used for heating in homes and buildings. We're far better off using heat pumps. Next slide. And I just want to briefly give a little bit more reason why we should never use hydrogen for heating. First of all, it's a very leaky gas, again. When you put hydrogen into a steel pipeline, it makes it more brittle, posing catastrophic risk, so that industry talks blithely about mixing hydrogen in with methane in pipeline systems. They've never done that more than about 10% or so. State of California recommends not doing more than 5%. It's a small, trivial addition you're talking about in any case. If they were actually to go higher than about 20%, you'd probably have to rebuild all the pipelines. You'd also have to change out all of the appliances in your home. They're not made to burn on hydrogen. Beyond that, the energy density of hydrogen is low. That's kind of a technical detail, but it means that to put it into a pipeline, you need to increase the pressure of the pipeline. That increases the risks of explosion. It increases leaks that occur, and also means that you're actually getting less of it through the fuel mix than you think. So it's using green electricity, renewable electricity to make green hydrogen and then putting it through pipelines for heating is also extraordinarily inefficient, extraordinarily efficient. If you instead use 100% renewable electricity directly to power heat pumps in your homes, you get 6 to 10 times more energy out of it. Hugely more effective way to go. So next slide. So fundamentally, any hydrogen, green hydrogen, and hydrogen made from nukes, I view as an opportunity cost at this point. We really need to move to a decarbonized future globally over the next couple to a few decades. And the best use of renewable electricity, which is scarce to that time period, and existing nuclear power plants, is to decarbonize the electric grid and not to make hydrogen. So hydrogen may play a role once we fully decarbonize the electric grid, but that's decades off into the future, and I think it's going to be a much, much smaller importance, maybe 1% of what the oil and gas industry is trying to sell us on this. So, next slide. So that's my story. Blue hydrogen is not green. Hydrogen in any form has a climate influence directly and also as an opportunity cost for how we could better use electricity. So delighted to have had the chance to talk with you tonight. And I'll hand it back to Annika and Tracy.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Howarth. That was really great. And we'll just get to the slide that I'm going to use for giving a brief update on the Mach 2 hub. I think most people probably know that there are proposed approximately 20 sites where there would be various components of this hydrogen hub, and they're located in the state of Delaware, south and central New Jersey, and southeastern Pennsylvania. But we do have very little information. It's imprecise. It changes regularly what they have on their website. Then they put an update, and they've taken, we took months between ourselves and other organizations trying to get Freedom of Information Act requests responded to. We finally, after a year and 8 months in another case, did get that information, but some of it is already out of date. So just want to point out that we don't know exactly what Mach 2 is going to be. It has not been funded yet. The money's been earmarked, but they haven't actually been approved to get any funding. And that announcement is expected to come in September. And with that, we would expect it to be a portion of the $750 million that they're supposed to be getting. Most of the other 3 other hubs that have been funded so far have gotten around 30 million. So we don't really know what the amount will be and what will be the first projects they go out of the gate with. So just looking basically at 4 different aspects of the components of Mach 2. The production is supposed to be nuclear, as Dr. Howarth said, that's called pink. They also say they're going to be using what's called renewable natural gas or biogas, which is another one of these false solutions that would use carbon capture. And they also mentioned refinery gray water at 1 or 2 different refineries, but specifically the refinery they mentioned is the PBF refinery in Delaware City, Delaware. And they also call this Mach 2 hub green because they are supposed to be using renewable energy sources, wind and or solar, and potentially they're going to use methane and frack gas. They deny that, but we have seen in the documents that we've received mentions of that, and the fact that they may end up going to the grid, for instance, directly to get electricity to produce hydrogen, which then, of course, that means the PJM grid, primarily frack gas, so it would be replaced by frack gas, dirty energy, basically. And we have other information too based on that if we get into that in the Q&A. And then transport, they talk about a major pipeline network of about 48 miles of pipeline, and then some new pieces of pipeline that they would have to put in. Some of them are greenfields. They'd be reusing some easements that they already have. They would use the pipelines in Philadelphia that are owned by the Philadelphia Gas Works for delivering it to homes. What we just heard about from Dr. Howarth was a terrible idea. And they also talk about having truck transportation use hydrogen and putting storage sites and refueling sites along the I-95 corridor, moving from Delaware up to Philadelphia. And finally, they mention railroads and ports, but it's very unclear what they exactly mean by that. Storage, they have storage sites on the maps that they've produced so far. And that would be at the production site in Philadelphia. So we're talking about storing hydrogen, which, remember, it's potentially explosive. It's highly flammable. It's very difficult to put a fire out that has been started by a release of hydrogen. And so that would be right in the city of Philadelphia at the PGW 2 facilities that makes their gas works. Also, it would be stored at the Delaware City, Delaware PBF refinery. Also at Salem, Salem Hope Creek, and also Oyster Creek. That's PSE&G and Holtec, and we'll talk about that a little bit in Q&A if you'd like. And they also mentioned that it may be stored or produced in Paulsboro at what they call the Rapano site, but many of us on this webinar tonight know it as the Gibbstown Logistics Center, and it's in Paulsboro. They also mentioned Marcus Hook, and that is supposed to be a major component to use hydrogen at the Monroe refinery. And then they would also store it and use it there. And they would also store it along those transportation routes that they mentioned and at end use locations, such as the SEPTA facility, which is the public transportation facility for Philadelphia. And we can talk a little bit more about that if you'd like to, but they're basically already beginning because they've already bought 10 hydrogen buses and they're buying it from a source outside of Mach 2 because Mach 2 doesn't have it yet, but they would be storing it there as well as using it and storing it at PGW in Philly. And then end uses include power plants. They say they're going to burn it in power plants, and they mention the Hilco site, which is a former PES refinery in Philadelphia. They talk about using it for heating through the Philadelphia Gas Works transportation, SEPTA, as I mentioned, and also the Delaware Public Transit and the New Jersey Public Transit are all mentioned as possible end uses that they have on the books. We don't know when that would happen. They also talk about using it at warehouses, such as the Hilco facility. They're supposed to build warehouses there. They're also supposed to build new warehouses outside of the PBF refinery, and they would use it for logistics there, like forklifts and that kind of thing. And also at terminals. They have terminals in Philadelphia that they plan to use it at. And also DuPont, chemical company in Delaware, is supposed to be an end use. We don't know exactly how. But I would like to point out there are none of what Dr. Howarth talked about with these, difficult to service needs such as steel making. None of those are listed now as end uses for the Mach 2 hub. They're all pretty much burning hydrogen and using it in fuel cells. Next slide, please. So on the next slide here, I'm not going to go too much into this because Dr. Howarth already covered environmental issues, but I would like to point out that when hydrogen is burned, such as at a power plant, it does, nitrogen oxides are formed when it's combusted. And that, of course, is a very difficult problem. Most of the places where, and actually pretty much all of the places in our very densely populated region where Mach 2's footprint stands, are communities that have been subjected to NOx and small particulate matter and other pollutants from the oil and gas industry, in some cases for more than 100 years. So all of this infrastructure that they're talking about would be layered right on top of the very same communities that have been burdened for all this time and are experiencing, of course, for years and continue to experience adverse health effects that have devastated many communities in our region. So I think we have to realize that it is dirty when it's combusted, and any plans like they say they're going to combust it. So any of those plans are actually going to be polluting. Also, PFAS, what they call forever chemicals, are used as fluoropolymers from that are produced from fuel cell and electrolyzer applications. And they're just finding this out through some science that's being scientific studies that are being done now. And then also we already heard from Dr. Howarth about the greenhouse gases, methane and carbon. So we consider hydrogen gas as a fault solution, and it has unavoidable greenhouse gas consequences. And I would just like to say for our for Delaware Riverkeeper Network and the organizations that are part of our Stop Mach 2 network, we have a line in the sand. We have a hard line against green hydrogen as well as any other color of hydrogen, because we think that there are far too many dangerous aspects, dangerous impacts for our communities, and because we want renewables to be used directly. Like Dr. Howarth said, that's the most efficient, that's the most green, and that's what we should be investing in. If we were investing $7 billion nationally from the IRA into direct renewables, would certainly benefit us in terms of fighting the climate crisis, and this doesn't at all. We also, just point out it's highly dangerous, explosive, inflammable. Already mentioned some of these things, so I won't go through it in terms of the leaks and it being inefficient and very expensive. But the last thing I do want to mention is that there's supposed to be a community benefits plan developed by Mach 2 and all the hydrogen hubs, but we have seen that this plan has completely failed in Mach 2. There has been no engagement of communities that are expected to be host communities where these projects would go. Now they say, oh, we'll be doing that down the road, but we know as activists and we know as people who live in these communities that once the permit is issued and they have a public comment period, it's too late to stop a project. We want to be able to stop Mach 2 now, and that's why we're working now to stop Mach 2. And no matter what color the hydrogen is. And in terms of the community benefits or the community engagement, we found out through discussions that we have had and questions and answers that we've asked to Mach 2 and to the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, which is under the Department of Energy and is carrying out these hydrogen hubs, that no host community can say no. There's no right of refusal. So no matter what they may offer in terms of some jobs or, helping your fire company or whatever they may offer as benefits, you're not going to be able to say no to this project coming to your community. And as we go forward, we've been looking through the documents that they have. They do have guidance documents about community engagement, and we can't find specific metrics that have been established by the federal government. It's all left open to having the individual hubs develop them. And we found out that there is no public process in the carrying out of a community's benefits plan. That means there's no public comment period before these projects would actually go to the permit stage and almost shovel to the ground. So that opportunity of the public being able to say back to Mach 2 and the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations what their concerns are does not exist in a formal way. There's no public comment period, and how the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations actually evaluates Mach 2 and all the hydrogen hubs will not be made public either. It's going to be kept as a secret behind closed doors, and that was established in a conversation we had with those agencies. So there's a lack of transparency. It's a big problem. We continue to fight as a network, and at the end, we're going to talk about an upcoming September 11th action that we have. Just as an example of how Mach 2 has kept the public out, you have to pay to go to meetings. You have to pay $25 if you're a member of Mach 2, it's a nonprofit corporation, or you have to pay $50 if you're not. And there have been 3 so far, and we had an action outside of the one that was held at the SEPTA office in Philadelphia. We're going to have one outside of the Holtec headquarters in Camden on September 11th. There's a link in the chat that has been shared, and we'll be following up, sending the link so you can sign up and get more details on that. Gathering 8:30 a.m. at the Holtec headquarters. You can find out where that is. So that's the end of my presentation, and we'd like now to go to questions and answers. And Annika is going to take those questions off of the chat and the Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah, so the first question we have is, so how much gas does it take to produce 1 unit of hydrogen, and what % of the gas industry does this represent?
Well, it takes, if you want to produce 1 molecule of hydrogen, it takes about 1.3 molecules of methane. So 1.3, not on a weight basis, but on a mole or molecule basis, 1.3 units of natural gas to make 1 of hydrogen. Of the hydrogen that's I'm not exactly sure off the top of my head about the total amount of hydrogen. The number 1 use for hydrogen in the US right now is to make synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, and that is responsible for about 7 or 8% of all natural gas use in the United States. The other major uses are making plastics and in oil refineries, which together probably would double or triple that number. So somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 to 20% of US natural gas today is being used to make hydrogen.
Great. And the next question we have is, if hydrogen is a solution for, quote, hard to abate sectors, then why aren't any Mach 2 projects addressing hard to abate?
Well, I don't know if Bob knows too much about Mach 2. I would just say that it has to do with our geography. We don't have any of those facilities that are being targeted. There are other end uses that are listed in the documents we have received, and they're on our website. And those are home heating, transportation, such as the SEPTA buses, power plants, and other combustion of hydrogen. Those are the heating purposes at refineries. Those are the purposes. Bob, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, no, those are all terrible purposes for hydrogen, right? That's straight out of the playbook of what big oil and gas wants. And the very, very poor uses for hydrogen. Buses, you're far better off with an electric bus. They're far more energy efficient than one running off of hydrogen. Home heating, as I said, it's 6 to 10 times more efficient to use an electric heat pump in a building as opposed to heating with hydrogen. And it's true across the board for all of those uses. So this is just it's the messaging from big oil and gas that got carried along. The reason we're living with this all is because the IRA has some wonderful parts to it. Overall, I'm glad the law passed for sure. But in order to get it passed, Joe Manchin had to be brought along, and Joe Manchin brought his oil and gas friends right in there to the negotiations, and all of the hydrogen stuff is coming from them through him.
Next question we have is, do the estimates of greenhouse gas emissions change or stay similar if a company uses autothermal reforming instead of steam methane reforming?
That's a good question. I don't have a great answer for it. Our paper, my paper with Mark Jacobson, looked just at the steam methane reforming, which is the process I referred to. The auto reforming process has not been used commercially in the United States or anywhere in the world, as far as I know. It's something that's being developed in academic labs and maybe in industry labs, but there's a lack of transparent information on what the energy needs are and therefore what the emissions are. So for our paper, we completely ignored it. There is no commercial hydrogen made from that in the United States, or at least there was not as of 3 years ago when we wrote our paper. 96% of hydrogen is coming from steam methane reforming. The other 4% is from renewable electricity, not auto reforming. So my guess would be that the auto reforming would be similar, but I can't say that definitively.
Another question is, to your point about moving away from the colors of hydrogen, we've noticed the language around low carbon or only measuring by carbon intensity, regardless of the energy source or mix. Is there really a way for gas-based hydrogen to be low carbon? How can we help bust this myth?
That's a great question. And no, there's no way to make methane from natural gas or any fossil fuel and have it be low carbon. But the devil is in the details of how you do the accounting for that. Our paper demonstrated it had a very large greenhouse gas footprint. That's what I just showed you. The Department of Energy is relying on a model called the GREET model that's run out of the National Lab, Argonne National Lab. And the GREET model gives estimates that are far lower than what we have. Now, why is that? Well, they make two assumptions. One is they only look at methane compared to carbon dioxide on a 100-year time frame, which dramatically understates the damage methane can do and has historically done to the climate. And they also grossly underestimate the methane emissions. They rely on methane emissions from the official U.S. government inventory held by the EPA, and that's based on industry self-reporting without any independent verification. So according to those industry reports, methane emissions have been going down very rapidly over the last 10 years, about the time that I and other scientists started saying they're going up. We now have, as I point out, that paper that came out in March in Nature has close to 1 million independent observations verified in the field, not industry self-reporting, and they show methane emissions that are much, much, much higher than the U.S. official inventory. So the GREET model, which is if we end up relying on that and they don't make corrections for the best science, could dramatically understate the problem with hydrogen. And I think it's we in the scientific community are pushing hard to try and get the best science into there, but we could use some help.
I have a question, Bob, related to the GREET model. That's GREET for folks who you can Google it and get it. How can scientists and those who have been studying hydrogen change the GREET model? I mean, what is the pathway to making that? Because it seems like it really is a stumbling block because they're basically fudging their story.
Yeah, they wouldn't say that, but yeah, the people who manage the GREET model are scientists and engineers who work for the Argonne National Lab. And it's a big complicated model. It looks at greenhouse gas emissions life cycle analyses from all sorts of different fuels and all. It's not hydrogen. Hydrogen would be less than 1% of what they do. So there's tons of input to there. The gatekeepers do what they say is their best to use the most up-to-date science for the parameter input. But there could be some political pressure on this, right? I mean, if you want to say you should be using the numbers which are coming out of this paper in Nature or out of my research or under other independent science instead of the official U.S. estimates, they can say, well, no, we have to use the official estimates. In terms of the 100-year time frame, our paper uses 20 years, which is much more representative of the harm methane does. The keepers of the parameter input will tell you that they have to use a 100-year time period because that's what the United States government says we have to use. And they then say that's because it's required by the Kyoto Protocol, which is nonsense because the U.S. never ratified the Kyoto Protocol. And the Kyoto Protocol, which is decades old, does indeed, as one tiny, tiny bit, say, yeah, you should look at methane on a 100-year time period. But, the science has grown so much since then, it's an outdated thing. And the oil and gas interests are desperate to hold on to that and keep that out of the argument. So it's where science and politics interact is the answer. But the people who control those numbers are the employees of the National Lab.
Well, so building off of that, we do have a question that says, Dr. Howarth, you mentioned scientists could use some help getting better science into the decision-making process. How can concerned citizens help?
Well, the two things I just mentioned in the GREET model, it's using the best available out of the peer-reviewed literature by independent scientists, a million observations as opposed to the unverified information that comes from industry on methane emissions. I mean, that's a clear case to make. Maybe it sounds a little complicated, but it's pretty straightforward. And making the case that we look at methane on a 20-year time frame instead of a 100-year. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been saying for 15 years that the 100-year choice that the U.S. government says we must use, they say it's completely arbitrary. It's not based on science, really. And yet they pretend it is. So, getting our congressmen, getting our senators to understand that and to push on it. And some of them get it. I talk regularly to the staff and even a few U.S. senators personally, and they get that. They're trying to push. But if more politicians hear from more people, I think that could make a real big difference. It's coming up right now. It's being argued in the hydrogen context, but it's also being argued in the liquefied natural gas export thing. The Biden administration put a pause on exports of LNG, in part based on a paper of mine that's a preprint at that time. It's coming out soon, I hope. But it's the same set of arguments on methane emissions and LNG. And historically, the government used the GREET model for LNG too. And their estimates for what the greenhouse gas footprint are for LNG are a little less than half of what my estimates would be, just based on those timeframes and methane emission differences. People in the White House are paying attention to that. U.S. senators are paying attention to that. Someone, the Department of Energy, is going to have to come down on one side or the other sometime in the next 6 months, say, on that. So it's a great time to be pushing politicians to pay attention to it.
Yeah, and I would just add there's going to be an opportunity for public comment into a rulemaking that's being put out by the Department of Energy later this fall and into next year that relates to the LNG pause that Dr. Howarth just mentioned. And in that public rulemaking, these scientific arguments that are based, as Dr. Howarth said, based on independent peer-reviewed literature, as opposed to a policy adopted by EPA, decades ago or whatever. Those arguments about how a determination should be made by the Department of Energy about whether or not LNG authorization for LNG export should occur to non-free trade nations is a place to make that argument. And Delaware Riverkeeper Network and organizations that are involved in this network, and many organizations around the nation that are involved in all of the LNG and fracking fights will be working on that. So as soon as that public opportunity comes up, one way to press forward this argument that we have to use true and accurate estimates of, full life cycle estimates of the impacts of methane and hydrogen, but in this case, it'll be methane, is a place we can carry that forward. And I know that Ken Dulski just put into the chat about New Jersey actually passed a law that says that you have to use the 20-year time frame. Now, whether or not it's being done, is something that people always have to advocate for. But in the absence of action at the federal level, often states, people start taking action at state level, at least in the interim, to make sure that, the state decisions that are being made are based on sound science. So that's just another point that people can do in the different states.
So the state of New York has required that since 5 years ago as well.
That's in the climate plan, right? You
Yes,
worked
it is.
on that.
It's core.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
And the state of
can you talk a
Maryland
little bit?
also
Can you
requires
talk
it.
a little bit about it, that plan? Because I know you were involved.
I was involved in that
our,
part of it, with our climate law passed in 2019, but various versions of it were passed through our state assembly way back through 2015. And the original version in 2015, I thought was fairly weak in some details. And I wrote an op-ed to the Albany Times-Union saying so. And the sponsors of the bill called me up and said, well, work with us to make it better. Steve Engelbright was the lead sponsor at the time, an assembly person from Long Island. And he and his staff worked closely with me over several weeks, and we revised it, highlighting things like the 20 years. And another thing is, here in New York, we banned fracking, right, a long time ago. But our use of fracked natural gas has gone up faster in this state than any other state in the country since the time we banned it. So, we're getting our fracked gas from Pennsylvania and West Virginia and Ohio. Methane emissions are mostly in those states, not here, right? And yet they're there because of our use of fracked natural gas. So the climate law that we put through and that was finally passed and signed into law says that we should take ownership responsibility for those methane emissions if they occur outside the state of New York because of our use of the gas, which I think is also a really progressive way to think about. I'm very, very pleased with that.
Absolutely. We just have about a few minutes left. And Annika, do we have maybe one more question? And we will be saving the chat and trying to answer chat questions or Q&A that we didn't get to, but we do want to put our last slide up just to talk about how people can get involved and some of the links to get more information. So do we have one more question, Annika, or did we pretty much cover?
We have a bunch of questions, but I think maybe a good one to end on would be just a question of, because we keep hearing about the convenience of hydrogen. So this question is, how can it be better to store, would it be better to store, how is it better to store excess electricity as hydrogen instead of in batteries? Isn't converting electricity to hydrogen and then back to electricity very inefficient?
Yeah, no, it is inefficient. So I don't personally think it's a great way to store electricity generally, but there might be some situations, say if you had a offshore wind turbine. Well, I'm not even sure. Let me not go there. I tend to agree. We're better off using other ways to store electricity, but it's still under debate. People are still exploring technologies, and it may be that we find that hydrogen can play a role there in the future. I don't think it's going to be a large role.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to our last slide and people can see some of the links that we have, and also some of the actions that are coming up. So I mentioned about these, what they call meetups that Mach 2 is having, these private meetings that are aimed at getting businesses to support Mach 2. And you have to pay to go to these, and yet they're having no open, free public meetings alongside those. They're only having these meetings for the last 3 months. So May, June, July, they are now in August. I think it was actually June, July, and August are the 3 that they've had. And we will be having an action outside of the Holtec headquarters in Camden, 8:30 a.m. on September 11th, before the meetup occurs at the Holtec headquarters. So if you want to join us, click on the link that's Annika put in the chat, or also the Action Network link that's on this last slide also has that information. And we'll be sending it out again through our follow-up email with a link to the recording of this. Also would just like to say that, you can get involved. We have actions that we're doing. We're building. We have various subcommittees working on various aspects of stopping Mach 2. And if you'd like to get involved, there's a sign up that you at the Action Network platform. And again, it's the same link, and we'll put it in the chat. Please go ahead and sign up, because we'd love to have more people involved. We do have a network of organizations, and we have been doing quite a bit in terms of trying to garner information and share it out. Just 2 days ago, we sent a letter to all the federal elected officials that are within the footprint of the Mach 2 project. Remember, that's Delaware, South Eastern Pennsylvania, and South Central New Jersey, telling them about these meetups and the lack of any public engagement, and how unfair this is, and how communities are just not going to stand for it. And we want to meet with them to discuss it. We want this changed. And also the secrecy surrounding the whole community benefits process. So things like that are things that you could get involved in, or if you're with an organization, you might want to sign on to that letter. So please do that. We have a petition to halt the SEPTA hydrogen bus project. Great. It was great to hear Dr. Howarth, throw that one out the window, because truly this is something that SEPTA has moved ahead without any public input. There was no public hearing. There was no discussion with communities where these hydrogen trucks will be traveling through to bring the hydrogen. And it's all going to be happening at the Midvale Station, which is right in the middle of communities in Philadelphia, and a county park and that kind of thing. So we're really talking about very dense populations being exposed. And then if you want to learn more, our webpage has this information on it at Delaware Riverkeeper Network. As we get information such as responses to FOIA requests and other documents, we put them up there. The maps that have been produced, as imprecise as they are, and they're changing all the time, they're up there. So please go there and visit that, and you can find out more. So we're at 7:32, and we try to be very careful about honoring everybody's time. But I want to thank Dr. Howarth for joining, because this has really been an important webinar for us, because we want people to understand the science and where blue hydrogen is coming from. And even though they say Mach 2 is going to be green, we don't believe it. We know that there are plans, and you can read between the lines in their documents, that they are going to be using natural gas, which of course is fracked gas, fossil gas. And they're looking at it, as you said, Dr. Howarth, it's a way for the industry and, to keep going. And they're looking desperately for markets for this fracked gas, and trying to send it overseas as LNG, using it to make hydrogen. And the other hydrogen hub in Pennsylvania and the western part of Pennsylvania is all blue hydrogen. And it's devastating. We know what fracking has done to the communities of Pennsylvania. We know that public health impacts, they're absolutely devastating. And we know the environmental impacts. We already see the impacts to our streams and waterways and groundwater. to our forest and our natural systems. And we'll all be, I think, or down the road, those that come after us will be cursing us like we curse, the tens of thousands of miles of streams in Pennsylvania that are ruined by the coal industry. So, we're trying to stop it before it gets any further. So thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Howarth, for coming out tonight and helping us understand this, walking us through the science. Very, very.
Appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Very enlightening. Thank you. We will have another webinar. We have one every month, and the recordings of the past ones are all on our website. The September webinar may be devoted to what they're actually funding if they get their award of funding in September. And then the October one is based on the lack of clear regulation of hydrogen hubs and the development of hydrogen. So we have two attorneys who will be the experts speaking about that. So we'll be sending you the details. It will be the last Wednesday in September. We'll be sending you those details once we find out if they're actually going to get their funding. If not, we'll be addressing safety. Thank you all for coming in.